Well, let me tell you what we do in my lab. In my lab, we're teaching people what to see and teaching them to see different things. And our goal here is to learn enough about visual learning to make it useful for visual rehabilitation. We'd like to be able to train people who have difficulty with perception. And now we're not talking about difficulty with their eyes. We're talking about people whose brains don't use the retinal images correctly, whether we can help them to use tricks of perceptual learning in order to actually see better. And there are a few classes of people who are like that. People with traumatic brain injury from accidents, or we're seeing a lot of these people now from the Gulf War, from Iraq and Afghanistan. And the visual system is damaged, and there are some specific things that they don't do very well, like paying attention to isolated objects in the visual field. So it's very difficult to avoid visual distraction. Can you actually recover the ability to pay attention to particular things in the visual field? And much of our current work uses these perceptually bistable figures because they're very tractable scientifically. Here's one you may have seen. This one is billed as, you look on the internet and it's supposed to tell you whether you're right brain or left brain, right? Well, okay. But if you look at her foot, you might be able to make her switch directions. Look at the foot that's moving back and forth, and that sometimes we'll bring it to the front, and you'll see the foot go this way, and then this way, and then this way. If all you see is rotation this way or the other direction, well, logically you can probably understand why this is an ambiguous figure, that your brain could have seen it the other direction. If you try hard enough, you'll be able to make it switch. We don't use that one in our lab. But we do use some figures like this. These are so-called Lisa Zhu figures. Thanks for the light, that's helpful. These Lisa Zhu figures are ambiguous. Most people right now would see them rotating either this way or that way. And interestingly, some people will see them rotate like this. They'll go back and forth. And there's one other interesting thing that you can see if you look really carefully on these figures. Take a look at this right one now. I've put in some shading cues, or rather, Stuart put in some shading cues. And you can see the other ambiguity. This is now a fixed cross, and the thing is actually rotating around a horizontal axis. Can you see that? It's up front, it's far, bottom, coming up the front, top, going down the back. That's a little X. Not everybody will be able to see that because you have to have a good view of that junction. So it's a really ambiguous figure. So that's an example of the kinds of figures that we use. And what we'll do is something like this. Here's an ambiguous figure. This is a cube. It's called a Necker cube. And it would be ambiguous. You would be able to see it go either way, except we've put this pole through the middle of it. Right? And if you look, it may be going the wrong way for some people, even though it has the pole there, in which case it looks really weird. But in the laboratory, this pole and some other cues that we add in there, we sometimes put in binocular disparities and shading cues on this guy. We can force you to see the front of the cube, the near part of the cube, as going from your right to left, right? So the front part of the cube is going right to left. And we might ask people to fixate that little square at the bottom. The dot is part of the task we use so that people don't just tell us which way they see it rotating, but they can tell us whether the dot is moving the same direction as the front or the back of the cube, and then they don't notice that we're always making it rotate the same direction on the top. Here's a cube that's going the other direction, and now we're going to train a different part of the visual field to see objects rotate this way. This is kind of like a Pavlovian conditioning paradigm where we just show you these two objects rotating in different directions. And then go to the truly ambiguous stimulus. So this one here is truly ambiguous. It can be seen either way. And the question is, will people's visual systems have learned to see this ambiguous object the way we've been training them? In which case, what we have done is teach them some statistics about the world that they can then exploit during perception. Now, it's perception in our funny little laboratory world, but the idea is that this is a process that hooks into natural processes that are operating all the time while our eyes are open, gathering up statistics from the real world and using them to see better. Okay? So we'll show a whole bunch of those disambiguated training trials with the rod through the middle. In that case, there were some above the mark and some below. And then we'll put in some of those ambiguous test trials. Some of them will be above, some of them will be below. And the question is, what happens on those test trials? And you get data like this. This is data from 8 people. The y-axis is showing the percent of trials, of those ambiguous trials, the ambiguous test trials, that were judged as trained. Right? And very quickly, people start seeing those objects the way that we have trained them to see it. And the real question, if this is learning, it should last another day. This is the prediction for what would happen if people come in the next day. We show them, instead of having the top go right to left, we now have the top go left to right, and the bottom go right to left. So we're going to switch the training on day 2. If people come back on day 2 with basically a new, fresh visual system and they haven't actually learned anything, this is the data that you'd get. It's just a mirror image of what we got on day 1. They'd be just learning exactly the opposite of day 1. And that's not what happens. Instead, they unlearn what they learned on day 1. And if you continue this out for a 3rd day and a 4th day and a 5th day, they just keep going down. And here's some data that from a single session. This, we've broken the session into lumps of trials. We've got about 70 trials here, and then we reverse it for the next 350 trials, and it's pretty consistent. People have very rapid learning at the beginning, and then they change their mind much more slowly. When you reverse it, it's like, hey, I already figured out what I should be seeing there. Now you're telling me it's different. First thing I'm going to do is say, hey, I'm not going to trust this thing at all, and then I'm slowly going to start trusting it according to the new meaning. But it takes a while.